The first thing you notice is the silence, the kind that feels heavier than air, stretched across a land once ruled by gods and kings. Beneath your feet, buried in the dust of ancient Sumer, tablets sleep, inscribed with a timeline that should be impossible. Lifetimes measured not in decades, but in tens of thousands of years. They speak of an age before the flood, when 8 rulers held dominion over Earth for 241,000 years, leaving behind a legacy both divine and forbidden. Tonight, we awaken that buried record to ask not just how such history could exist, but why its authors may have tried to conceal what it truly meant, and what they feared we would one day remember. It begins, as many great rediscoveries do, with dust and silence. In the baking heat of southern Iraq, a team of early 20th century archaeologists brushed away the soil from a cluster of broken tablets. Fragments of ancient clay that crumbled at the edges yet held within them stories older than any empire carved in stone. The site was Nippur, once a jewel of Sumer, a city older than Babylon and steeped in the scent of temple incense and river mud. The diggers were searching for routine records of trade or taxes, but what they uncovered instead was a document that refused to fit into history's normal rhythm of time. When the cuneiform characters were first cleaned and pieced together, scholars stared in disbelief. The text was deceptively simple at first glance, a list of cities and names, one after another, marked with the length of each ruler's reign. Yet the numbers attached to those names broke mathematics itself. Alulim ruled in Eridu for 28,800 years. Al-Algar ruled for 36,000. The scribes had written these figures without a hint of irony, carved them into clay as confidently as we might note a decade or a century. And at the end of that sequence, one quiet line. Then the flood swept over. Years later, multiple copies of this same list surfaced across Mesopotamia, each echoing the same impossible chronicle. One tablet found at Larsa, another unearthed near Kish, a third cracked and burned, discovered by a shepherd who mistook it for a brick and used it to prop up a fence post before it was recognized as priceless. The repetition was undeniable. No single scribe's error could explain it. Whoever wrote these lists was following a tradition so old it seemed to blur into myth itself. When translators at the University of Pennsylvania and later in Berlin attempted to render the text into plain language, they found themselves struggling not with vocabulary, but with belief. If these were literal years, then Sumerian kings had lifespans stretching beyond humanity, back into numbers that only the stars could measure. To dismiss them as nonsense felt too easy. To accept them as history invited madness. Somewhere between disbelief and devotion, scholars began to wonder if the numbers masked something symbolic. Cycles of the heavens, perhaps, or mathematical codes disguised as chronology. In smoky libraries where Assyriologists argued deep into the night, theories multiplied. Some saw the King List as semi-historical, a record of real dynasties stretched for prestige. Others proposed it preserved echoes of divine rule, eras when gods themselves walked as rulers before mortal kings took their place. A few wild-eyed dreamers, soon labeled pseudo-archaeologists, whispered that the kings were not human at all, but beings of otherworldly origin who taught civilization before vanishing beneath the flood. The clay refused to confirm or deny any of them. It simply sat, cold, ancient, and supremely indifferent, holding its secret. Each stylistic choice of the scribe tells its own quiet story. The wedge-shaped lines pressed deeply into the clay, as though the writer wanted their truth to survive eternity. The order of cities, Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sipar, Shurupak, traces the spine of early civilization along the plain where the two great rivers once braided together. The list ends where geological memory begins, at the flood that also survives in the Epic of Gilgamesh and in distant echoes across the world. Between these lines, history and myth blur, yielding the unsettling impression that the King List was never meant to be one or the other, but both, a bridge between what the Sumerians lived and what they remembered. When the tablets were finally displayed in museums, visitors passed by them almost without notice, eyes drawn instead to gold jewelry or statues of lions. Yet for the few who paused, something stirred, a quiet vertigo. To stare at those carved numerals is to feel time stretch beyond comprehension, to sense that humanity once imagined kingship on the scale of eternity. The artifact asks a disarming question. How much of the past have we reduced to myth simply because its truth feels too vast to fit into our calendars? As the archaeologists packed up their finds and the sun sank across the plain, a hot wind swept over the ruins, whispering through reeds that may once have grown beside the courtyards of Eridu itself. In that moment, it was easy to believe the tablets had not truly been discovered, but had chosen to reappear, emerging from the deep sleep of clay to remind modern humanity that its oldest stories might not be stories at all. The kings of 241,000 years were awake again, and the world, though skeptical, could no longer pretend it hadn't heard them. Long before scholars puzzled over impossible reigns carved into tablets, the civilization that produced them was learning to record the rhythm of life in the first language the earth ever carried. The land between the rivers, the Greeks would later call it Mesopotamia, lay like an emerald crescent in a world otherwise dry and wind-worn. From the snows of Anatolia flowed two serpentine lifelines, the Tigris and the Euphrates. Each spring they spilled their silt across the plains, turning sand to soil and hunger to abundance. In that annual miracle of flooding, humanity found both its fear and its fortune, the same dual nature that pulsed through every future myth. To live there was to build a relationship with water measured in gratitude and dread. A careless season could drown villages. A stingy one could starve them. Over generations, the Sumerians learned to read the moods of the rivers, much as we read clouds or headlines. Canals cut the plains, dikes framed the flow, and scattered settlements began to link like pearls along irrigation channels. Somewhere around 6,000 years ago, the first cities stepped into being: Eridu, Uruk, Lagash, all of them products of an agricultural experiment that turned nomads into architects and farmers into mathematicians. With cities came something newer still: memory with a backbone. Oral tales could no longer keep pace with granaries, trade agreements, temple donations, and flood schedules. So someone, perhaps a weary accountant of sacrifices, perhaps a visionary priest staring into firelight, pressed a reed into clay and made marks to stand in place of words. Those wedges evolved into cuneiform, the first writing system humanity would claim as its own. At first, the symbols counted goats and barley rations, but soon their trick proved too powerful to confine to the marketplace. What could record a debt could also record a prayer, and what could preserve a trade could equally preserve a story. It is easy to forget now that writing and religion were born in the same breath. The temples of Sumer were not only sanctuaries, but warehouses and archives. Priests doubled as administrators who tallied offerings for gods that were also forces of nature. Enlil, lord of the wind; Enki, keeper of waters; Inanna, the morning star. In these divine bureaucracies, math and myth shared the same shelf space. To measure rainfall was to honor Enki's gifts. To calculate planetary paths was to read divine will. The world didn't yet know the border between science and faith, because the border didn't exist. From that merging of numbers and awe came calendars, star charts, even the concept of law. When a boundary dispute or grain theft threatened the order of a city, scribes turned to clay, the same medium used to record the favor of gods. Over time, that simple act of inscription would give us Hammurabi's code, astronomy, contracts, and perhaps most profoundly, history itself. The awareness that time could be written down. To carve yesterday into stone was to defy forgetting. Standing beside the twin rivers, one can almost feel how such a realization might have struck the Sumerians. Each flood erased the marks on the ground just as easily as memory erases yesterday's lessons. Writing became humanity's answer to impermanence, its substitute for immortality. A temple might crumble, a monarch might vanish, but the clay beneath their feet could remember. And so the same material used for the King List also greeted the sunrise prayers of priests, the receipts for barley, the hymns to Inanna's light, and the first treaties between cities. Myth and measurement, faith and fact, lived comfortably together. The Sumerians did not see contradiction in inscribing both census data and celestial legends on identical tablets. To them, the universe was an ordered story, and numbers were simply another form of poetry. Each time a stylus struck soft clay, a small click echoed through the ages, the sound of humans teaching stone how to think. Bit by bit, these marks grew into collective consciousness, the awareness that knowledge could outlive its keeper. Without it, there could be no king lists, no dynasties remembered, no sciences born. Civilization, as we know it, began not with monuments or weapons, but with that first hesitant inscription drying beneath the Mesopotamian sun. Out of rivers that sometimes betrayed them, people learned a deeper current, the stream of memory itself. And from that current surged everything that followed. Cities rising from reeds, myths climbing from floods, and the first glimpse of eternity written in wet clay. Before there were kings with crowns and courts and armies marching to the rhythm of drums, there were gods who ruled with thunder, wisdom, and wind. To the Sumerians, divine authority was not an abstract idea hovering above them. It had once walked among them. In their stories, civilization did not rise from human ambition alone, but from the guidance of immortals who descended from the heavens when the world was still half-formed from clay and chaos. These beings carried names that would survive across millennia, whispered in temples and myth alike. Anu, Enlil, Enki. Anu was the father sky, distant and immense. From his vaulted realm, the stars were his servants, the measure of his power. He was the axis of heaven, governing not with armies, but with decree. Enlil, his son, embodied the air and the storm, a god who could bless the harvest with cool winds or flatten it with tempests if disrespected. To the Sumerians, Enlil's breath-filled lungs and his temper-carved rivers. Then came Enki, lord of the deep waters and of cunning, patron of wisdom, knowledge, and the subtle art of problem-solving. Where Enlil ruled by command, Enki persuaded by insight. Together, they formed a divine trinity that mirrored the needs of those who worshiped them: stability, control, and intellect. In the earliest myths, these powers did more than oversee. They organized. They distributed the me, the sacred formulas of civilization. Weaving, agriculture, music, law, architecture, even proper kingship. Each me was a divine recipe for order. The stories claimed that before mortals held such knowledge, the gods kept it among themselves. And when Enki saw humans struggling in the floodplains, he took pity and passed some of this wisdom down. Whether that deed was seen as compassion or transgression depended on which god you asked. The Sumerians recorded these divine dramas carefully, not as theology separated from daily life, but as commentary on how power should work. When later kings rose in Uruk and Lagash, they claimed lineage not from mortals, but from these celestial founders. If Anu once presided over heaven, his descendant would preside over earth. If Enki shaped the rivers, his chosen heir would shape the laws. Thus, divine reign blended into mortal dynasty as seamlessly as the rivers merging near the Persian Gulf. Kingship did not emerge from conquest. It descended from heaven, a phrase that appears repeatedly on tablets. Possession of the throne meant carrying a fragment of divine mandate, like a spark preserved from some sacred fire. To modern eyes, this might appear as clever political theater, a way to sanctify authority. But to the Sumerians, it was literal truth. How else could a handful of humans master irrigation, mathematics, and architecture seemingly overnight? The myth of gods descending to instruct mankind became a cultural explanation for a leap so swift it felt supernatural. In that light, the reigns of the gods before the flood were not measures of time, but measures of knowledge. Epochs defined by the dominance of one divine principle over others. And yet, beneath the mythology, it is easy to glimpse something more human: the memory of teachers. Perhaps these gods were not shimmering beings from the heavens, but revered elders, inventors, or tribes bearing wisdom from distant lands, later mythologized into cosmic figures. Names like Enki and Enlil may conceal ancestral titles passed down through generations of sages, transformed by reverence into divinity. A people emerging from prehistory, watching their world bloom with sudden intelligence, might truly believe such change could only come from beings greater than themselves. Whatever the origin, these divine rulers gave the Sumerians a cosmology of structure. The heavens reflected the hierarchy of their cities. The gods' feuds mirrored the quarrels of kings and priests. Myth became governance. To obey one's ruler was to obey the divine order. Rebellion risked disturbing the balance of creation itself. So when the King List begins with the words, "Kingship descended from heaven," it is not merely poetic. It is a continuation of that theology, a statement of cosmic legitimacy written into human politics. The first kings were not seen as men who claimed godhood, but gods who graciously accepted mortality for a while. And as centuries passed and the divine presence faded into memory, those impossible ages, the tens of thousands of years assigned to primordial rulers, became the only language left to describe how eternal their gift had seemed. To write of a 30,000-year reign was not to measure time, but to confess wonder. The sense that knowledge itself might have come from stars that once walked upon the earth. On the tablets that held the Sumerian King List, the numbers stood out like constellations, great spans of time carved into soft clay with an almost arrogant confidence. 28,000, 36,000, 72,000. Add them together, and the reigns of the first 8 rulers stretched to roughly 241,000 years, a length of history that mocks the limits of flesh. For generations since their discovery, those figures have haunted scholars and dreamers alike. Were they proof of legend, the residue of gods masquerading as kings? Or did the Sumerians mean something more subtle? A language of numbers our modern eyes have forgotten how to read? The first translators treated the totals as exaggeration or scribal error, assuming some ancient accountant had misplaced a decimal or added an extra zero fueled by royal vanity. But the problem deepened when multiple copies of the tablets, separated by centuries and cities, repeated identical figures. Errors rarely replicate themselves so faithfully across time. Instead, there seemed to be intent, design hidden in surplus digits. Linguists turned to the nature of Sumerian numeration itself, hoping the secret lay in the symbols rather than the sentences. The Sumerians didn't count as we do. Their system was sexagesimal, built on 60, not 10. To us, it feels alien. To them, it was elegance. 60 divides neatly by 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, making it a mathematician's dream. Even now, we echo their logic every time we circle an hour in 60 minutes or a circle in 360 degrees. So perhaps, the scholars argued, these impossible reigns were not years as we know them, but cycles in a higher arithmetic, measures of celestial order written in base 60 instead of base 10. When the tablets say that Alulim ruled for 28,800 years, the number, when translated through sexagesimal patterns and lunar reckoning, could reflect something like 2,480 months, or symbolic multipliers of known astronomical cycles. Multiply and divide through the intricate meshes of the Sumerian calendar, and strange correspondences leap out. The precession of the equinoxes, the repeating rhythm of Venus visible in the sky, the long dance between the orbits of Jupiter and Saturn. It is as if the reigns were not chronicles of living kings at all, but spans of cosmic alignment, a ledger of the heavens. Other researchers noticed a second language at play within the digits. In Mesopotamian religion, numbers themselves carried divine resonance. 60 was sacred to Anu, the Sky Father. His son Enlil owned the number 50. Enki, Lord of Waters, the number 40. Add to that 30 for the moon god, 20 for the sun, and 15 for Ishtar, and a pattern falters toward meaning. Each ruling era may have been crafted to symbolize dominance by one deity's number above others. Mathematics as theology. A reign of 36,000, for example, is precisely 10 multiples of 3,600. The supreme number of a sar, a complete cosmic unit in Sumerian, a reckoning. To assign such a span to a king was not to date his flesh, but to declare his kingdom in sync with heaven's order. Still, skeptics remain. They argue that trying to extract astronomical truth from myth is wishful arithmetic, that no amount of base 60 sorcery can compress 241,000 years into plausibility. Yet even they admit the pattern is deliberate, not random. The numbers may have acted as mythic compression, encoding proportion rather than chronology, a way to say forever, with an elegance measurable by stylus and clay. Imagine a society new to writing, steeped in celestial observation, desperate to capture eternity using the tools it understood best. When they looked upward, they saw not emptiness, but clockwork. Stars moved in precise equations, and time itself felt reusable. To mark a god's dominion as 36,000 years was to mirror the timeless revolutions overhead. Perhaps then, these impossible lifespans were an early language of awe, the first mathematical poetry ever written, a way for human hands to press infinity into clay. And so, the enigma of 241,000 years remains unsolved but transformed. Whether those hundreds of thousands of years mask calculations of stars, hymns broken into ratios, or symbolic memorials to forgotten gods, they remind us that long before anyone measured time with machines, humanity already dreamed of numbers vast enough to touch eternity. Each wedge carved into the tablet whispers the same idea, that in accounting for their kings, the Sumerians were not measuring life. They were measuring the cosmos itself. If the Sumerian King List records the descent of kingship from heaven, then Eridu was the place where it touched the ground. South of modern-day Nasiriyah, not far from the lazy glint of the Persian Gulf, lie the remnants of that first city, the city of beginnings. In the heat, the ruins shimmer like a mirage, a scatter of low mounds that once were temples and courtyards, now reduced to dust and salt-crusted clay. Yet beneath those layers of ruin is a story so profound that archaeologists treat the ground itself as sacred text, reading its strata with the reverence others reserve for prayer. When spades first bit into Eridu's soil in the mid-20th century, the surprise was immediate. Beneath centuries of sand lay not one city, but dozens. Each generation had built directly atop the bones of the one before. Temple rising on temple, 16 layers in all, forming a vertical timeline of human awakening. At the lowest and oldest stratum, dating back more than 7,000 years, the archaeologists found a simple platform of packed clay where offerings of fish and small bowls of food had been left beside a hearth. It spoke of a people just leaving behind their nomadic past, gathering along the riverbank where fresh water mingled with seawater, where reeds swayed and fish were plentiful. As layers deepened, the evidence of ritual and order grew more complex. Shrines became halls, halls became temples, and in time the humble mound blossomed into a monumental ziggurat dedicated to Enki, the god of wisdom and sweet waters. Around it clustered houses of mud brick, narrow lanes, and eventually walls, signs of permanent life, of a community learning to organize itself around a spiritual center. It was civilization distilled into model form, the blueprint later cities would imitate for millennia. Eridu was not merely settled, it was conceived. The King List begins precisely here. In Eridu, Alulim became king. He ruled for 28,800 years. Whether Alulim was deity, monarch, or metaphor, archaeologists standing in his city can feel the pull of something foundational. The Sumerians believed that before Alulim, humanity lived scattered like starlight, tribes with no order beyond the hunt and the flood. His arrival marked the moment when leadership took form, a bridge between divine guidance and human governance. Perhaps Alulim was not one man at all, but the remembered embodiment of that transition, the awakening of organized rule, of community shaped by shared belief rather than by mere survival. Walking among the ruins today, silence presses close. The wind drifts through collapsed doorways, uncovering shards of paint that once gleamed turquoise and white. Somewhere beneath your feet may lie the corner of the first planned street or the base of the first wall, built not for shelter, but identity. Every brick whispers ambition, the dawning understanding that humans could mold their world as the gods once did. In that revelation, kingship and divinity braided together so tightly they became indistinguishable. To govern was to preserve cosmic balance. To design a city was to imitate creation itself. The Temple of Enki dominated the center because water dominated their lives. Offerings found inside its ruins, tiny clay models of boats, fish bones arranged in ritual order, suggest gratitude to the god who made the marshes generous and navigable. Yet beneath that gratitude lurks anxiety. Water could also betray, flooding fields, erasing homes. In revering Enki, they tried to anchor chaos. Society's very birth seems to have emerged as a negotiation between fear and faith. For the archaeologists dusting ancient stairways, Eridu is not the ruin of forgotten kings, but the fossil of an idea. That order must have an origin story. Each ascending layer shows a people learning that shared belief can shape stone, that ritual can command architecture, and that memory can outlast mortality. Perhaps that is why later generations remembered this place as the true beginning. Standing at the edge of its eroded ziggurat, where desert meets the ghost of sea, one feels that civilization itself first took a breath here, and the echo of that breath still drifts like a whisper through the sands, murmuring the first word humanity ever built from clay. Beginning. Long before the first canals of Sumer gleamed under the sun, legend says the world was young and ordered under a line of rulers whose names now sound like incantations. Alulim of Eridu, Alalgar of Bad Tibira, Enmen-Lu-Ana and Enmen-Gal-Ana of Sipar, Dumuzi of Bad Tibira, En-Sipaziana of Larak, and Ubara-Tutu of Shurupak. 8 kings before the waters came. To the modern mind, their reigns, 30,000, 40,000, 21,000 years, are impossibilities. Yet to the Sumerians, these were the ages of perfection, when divine order hung like a clear sky before it shattered. The King List treats the flood not merely as catastrophe, but as punctuation, a dividing line between eras of gods and the fragile dominion of men. Each of these rulers embodied something beyond governance. Alulim, first of the first, was called the shepherd who brought civilization to humankind. His city, Eridu, was paradise, the palm groves thick, canals alive with fish. To follow him was Alalgar, whose wisdom shone upon the plain like dawn. Archetypes rather than biographies. Order, light, plenty, rhythm. They ruled a world untouched by death, where the rivers flowed exactly as they should and time itself bent to the music of heaven. Such perfection could not last, and the tablets say simply, "Then the flood swept over, and kingship was taken to heaven." Those words find uncanny mirrors across cultures separated by oceans. Over in the highlands of what would become Canaan, storytellers centuries later spoke of Noah, a righteous man saved by divine warning when the world drowned in its own corruption. In Greece, Deucalion and Pyrrha rowed their wooden chest across endless water to repopulate the land. In India, Manu followed a talking fish that became the god Vishnu, who led him to safety atop the Himalayas. Among the Maya of Central America, the gods destroyed a wooden race of humans with floods and jaguars before recreating them from corn. Even far to the north, in the Epic of Gilgamesh engraved in the clay of Nineveh, there is Utnapishtim, the immortal who survived a deluge sent by wrathful gods and whose tale prefigures Noah's almost word for word. Beneath the differences of name and detail lies a single rhythm, a world washed clean, memory preserved by survivors, and new order descending afterward. For scholars and geologists alike, such consistency stirs uneasy fascination. Around the end of the last ice age, roughly 12,000 years ago, evidence indeed suggests a period of rapid melting and immense flooding. Meltwater from glaciers raised sea levels by hundreds of feet, swallowing coastlines that had cradled early settlements. In the plains of Mesopotamia, sudden storms and the bursting of rivers could easily have birthed memories of an ocean where no ocean belonged. To societies that measured eternity by the steadiness of the Euphrates, such a cataclysm would have felt world-ending. But to reduce the flood solely to geology is to miss the human heartbeat behind the myth. The Sumerians may have remembered a natural disaster, but in shaping it into sacred narrative, they transformed survival into purpose. The gods withdrew kingship because the world needed to restart its cycle. The deluge was not vengeance so much as reboot, a cosmic cleansing between ages where the divine reset creation's clock. When the waters receded, kingship returned, shortened and mortal, as though the new order required humility to keep it from repeating old arrogance. One can almost picture the storytellers of later dynasties gathering at temple steps, gazing toward the horizon where distant thunder rumbled, repeating to themselves the old warning, Balance must never be taken for granted. Alulim and Alalgar had been too long, too perfect, too near the gods. The flood was the horizon of consequence. After it, every ruler was measured by mortality, every city by its vulnerability to water and heaven alike. The antediluvian monarchs thus lived not as historical kings, but as symbols of humanity's first fall. A golden dawn swallowed by a tide that each culture, in its own language, would spend eternity remembering. When the Sumerian tablets tell us that the flood swept over and kingship was taken to heaven, the words sound like poetry. Yet beneath them lies a shadow of something geological, a memory burned into the planet as deeply as into myth. Across the world, evidence hides in mud cores and ice layers, in fossils of drowned forests, and in ghost coastlines buried far beneath modern seas. Sometime near the apparent dawn of civilization, around 10,000 BCE, Earth itself seems to have shifted mood. Ice sheets retreating from the last glacial age melted in violent pulses, releasing torrents so vast that whole climates trembled. Sea levels surged upward, rivers carved new paths with predatory precision. To humans living on the edges of those waters, it must have felt as if the gods had indeed overturned creation. The scientists who study those layers trace the clues with the same care as archaeologists reading cuneiform. In Greenland and Antarctica, ice cores reveal spikes of trapped methane and dust, silent witnesses to abrupt climate swings. In what is now the Persian Gulf, sonar maps show that between 12 and 8,000 years ago, it transformed from lush plain to inundated basin, forcing the first settlers of Mesopotamia northward. Even today, amid the Gulf's shallow waters, divers find ridgelines that may once have been river valleys. For the Sumerians' ancestors, that drowning land would have been paradise lost, a fertile delta suddenly consumed by the sea. The trauma of such events would not fade in a single lifetime. Flood survivors carry their memories like relics, passing them as cautionary songs to their children. Before long, those songs reach for the divine. The deluge becomes discipline from heaven, punishment for arrogance, or cosmic house-cleaning preparing the world for renewal. In that light, the phrase "kingship was taken to heaven" reads not as disappearance, but as suspension. Governance, order, the very rhythm of society was withdrawn until the waters rested, until humanity could begin again. Archaeologists at Shurupak, modern Farah, have uncovered exactly such punctuation in the soil. A thick stratum of river-borne clay sandwiched between older and later habitation layers, clear evidence that a catastrophic flood interrupted life there around 2900 BCE. The pottery below differs sharply from the pottery above, as though a generation had been erased between them. For Sumerians looking back, that break in continuity embodied something larger than a local disaster. It confirmed their worldview that time itself moves in cycles of creation and undoing. Every civilization seems to crave a reset, a mythic clean slate that allows meaning to be rewritten when chaos overwhelms understanding. The flood provided that stage. It re-established the contract between gods and mortals, reminding both of their proper boundaries. To the survivors who rebuilt the first post-flood cities, Kish, Uruk, Ur, the very act of construction became an act of devotion, a promise that order would be honored anew. From this renewal came the notion that kingship descended from heaven once more. The divine mandate, temporarily rescinded, was returned to humankind, not as eternal perfection, but as a fragile trust. One can imagine the first generations born after the waters receded. The elders would tell stories of a world that had been washed away. Cities dissolved, forests drifting like rafts, horizons erased. Around their fires, the younger listeners would learn that leadership is sacred because it is temporary, that even gods can start over. Those tales hardened into theology. Theology hardened into ritual. And eventually, someone carved the memory into clay. In that sense, the Great Flood is both history and metaphor. A literal event woven into an allegory about resilience. Modern science measures its sediments. Ancient myth measured its meaning. Both agree that there was a moment when human confidence drowned and was forced to surface anew, sobered, smaller, but capable of building again. From the interval between destruction and rebirth came the conviction that civilization must be continuously earned, that each rise of cities is simply the latest emergence from the last sea that tried to claim us. Behind the mythic glow of Sumer's impossible reigns lies a quieter brilliance, one carved in numbers rather than gods. The Sumerians were not only storytellers, but mathematicians, and their arithmetic worldview was as disciplined as it was imaginative. To understand their idea of kings who ruled for 36,000 years, one must first step into their counting system, a lattice built on the number 60. To the people of Mesopotamia, 60 was not random convenience. It was perfection. It could be halved, tripled, or quartered without remainder, a number whose edges never frayed. It was, quite literally, harmonious. While we live by tens and hundreds, the Sumerians measured life and cosmos by 60s. Their hours, circles, and calendars still echo it in our own world. 60 minutes, 360 degrees, 12 months. Each multiple carried symbolic weight. 12, for example, stood for completion, the full turning of the year under the watch of the zodiac's 12 constellations. Multiply that perfection, 12, by divine harmony, 60, and the result, 720, was a sacred cycle found everywhere from their geometry to their temple sequences. Then extend it to 60x60 Yorhars 3600, known to their scribes as a sar, a great unit of cosmic time rather than mere counting. When the King List declares that the earliest rulers reigned 10 sars, or 36,000 years, it may not be recording human lifespans at all, but describing epochs measured by these celestial units. 10 sars could reflect 10 revolutions of some larger cycle, perhaps planetary alignments or the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that takes roughly 26,000 years to complete. The numbers therefore act less as chronicle and more as code, expressing in familiar arithmetic the immeasurable order the Sumerians saw in the sky. In their temples, astronomer priests spent nights charting Venus and Jupiter, noting how regularly they returned to the same parts of heaven. To minds trained in this rhythmic precision, the universe did not seem chaotic or infinite. It seemed intensely organized. Mathematics was their theology, and numbers were the language of divine justice. The gods ruled by proportion, and so did their kings. When a monarch or city achieved balance and peace, the right mix of harvest, flood, and trade, it was, in their eyes, because that ruler's reign resonated with some celestial ratio. Thus, a longer numerical rule signified greater alignment with cosmic harmony. The ideal king reigned as long as the stars permitted him to stay in tune. Imagine their scribes laboring over damp tablets in lamplight, inscribing not literal calendars, but patterns. Years expressed in sequences of sars and nears, multiples of 60 layered like music. To us, the digits sprawl into absurdity. To them, they sang of eternity translated into manageable form. Just as a modern physicist might speak of light years to relate unimaginable distance through a human concept of time, the Sumerians used great numerical magnitudes to express spiritual magnitude. The difference between an ordinary reign and one illuminated by divine order. Seen that way, immortality was not flesh persisting against decay, but harmony persisting against chaos. A ruler's name attached to multiple stars meant that his age had achieved the serenity of the heavens, where planets travel endlessly in set paths. The idea that numbers could bestow perpetual life is not so alien when we realize we still use them to freeze meaning. A century remembered by a date, a lifetime by a birth year etched into stone. The Sumerians were simply bolder, engraving eternity itself into numerical rhythm. So when the King List gives Alulim and Alalgar their vast dominions of time, it may be reading like ledger entries of the cosmos. Each reign another stanza in a grand equation describing balance between earth and sky. For them, mathematics was not cold abstraction, but faith made tangible. Through multiplication and division, they sought to mirror the universe's breath, to render harmony indelible. In their script of wedges and symbols, immortality was not a gift of blood, but of numbers that never truly die. The Sumerian nights were vast and quiet, broken only by the pulse of wind and the hum of insects over the dark mirror of the Euphrates. In those hours before dawn, when the world felt freshly made, the tops of the great ziggurats reached into the starlight like ladders. Upon those terraces, wrapped in cloaks against the chill, stood the astronomer priests, the guardians of the heavens, the interpreters of its moods. Their eyes were trained not on scripture, but on the slow and deliberate turn of the firmament. Night after night, they etched the language of the cosmos into clay, believing each star trace a whisper from the gods. Up there, among the shadowed altars and low clay instruments, time was born. The priests watched the march of Sirius across the horizon, the monthly fate of the moon, the steady wandering of Jupiter. Their observations were meticulous, copied and recopied until they became time itself structured into pattern. The priests soon recognized cycles that repeated beyond a lifetime, astronomical constants so regular that only divine hands could have engineered them. In such order, they saw the blueprint for kingship, rule that mirrored the sky's unchanging balance. From these terraces, equations and prayers were indistinguishable. The measurement of the night sky became liturgy, and within a few generations, astronomy, geometry, and theology wove together so tightly that they could scarcely be separated. Each planet corresponded to a god, each god to a principle of rule, and every movement above heralded events below. The moon's thin return marked months of ritual. Venus's brilliant dawn was a sign for planting or war. The entire calendar of Sumer pulsed according to celestial administration. Humanity, in their model, merely enacted the motions already choreographed in heaven. When the Sumerians later wrote of kings whose lives spanned thousands of years, perhaps they were not thinking of flesh and bone at all. Perhaps they were recalling these immortal cycles first recorded by priests on ziggurat summits. The rulers of time may have been constellations, their reigns measured not in days, but in epochs, when one star or planet held prominence before passing its throne to the next. To see Mars burning red across a decade of skies was to witness the rulership of passion and war. The long grace of Venus represented serenity and growth. Jupiter, with its slow, regal progress, symbolized the weight of justice. The priests personified these forces, assigning them names and genealogies that later generations would interpret as kings who walked the earth. Inside the temple interiors, astronomical tables sat beside offerings of incense and oil. Each night's recording required purification, chants, and silence. Knowledge itself was ritual. To miscalculate an eclipse meant offending the heavens. Thus, knowledge and power became inseparable. Whoever interpreted the sky controlled the calendar. Whoever controlled the calendar commanded agriculture, trade, and worship. The astronomer priests were the empire's pulse keepers, their calculations dictating when the people sowed, harvested, or crowned a new ruler. If they declared that a celestial omen demanded renewal, cities obeyed. Over time, the line between observation and decree blurred, and the watchers of stars became the makers of destiny. Standing at the summit of the ziggurat, looking out across the sleeping plain, one might imagine those early priests sketching constellations into their tablets, aware that by doing so they were inscribing law as well as light. For them, the heavens were the truest archive, permanent, circular, immune to flood or decay. The myths that would one day speak of immortal kings could well have been inspired here, among the instruments of clay and bronze where cycles appeared eternal. The astronomer priests did not conjure rulers, they calculated them. A king of 36,000 years could easily have been a metaphor for the orbit that required the same span to return. In that delicate interchange between math and faith, dominion and devotion, Sumer found its rhythm. The ziggurats stood halfway between earth and sky, just as humanity stood between animal and God. On those steps, civilization learned how to measure eternity, how to translate the cold precision of starlight into the warmth of human story. It is here, among the priests and their nocturnal sigils, that the myth of divine kingship began to reflect not the glory of men ruling the heavens, but the heavens themselves ruling men. The belief that early rulers lived far beyond natural limits was not confined to the Sumerians. The same dream of endless reigns rises like morning mist from almost every corner of the ancient world. Whether carved into stone, painted on papyrus, or sung around tribal fires, humanity seemed drawn to a single conviction: that our beginnings were governed by beings who stood halfway between gods and men, whose lives stretched into ages rather than years. These echoes form a chorus across continents, repeating the refrain that time itself once bowed to divine order. In Egypt, scribes who wrote the king lists of Abydos and Turin recorded that before the pharaohs of flesh, there had been the followers of Horus, semi-divine rulers whose reigns reached into thousands of years. They were said to have descended from the sky with impossible wisdom, bringing the arts of building, healing, and governance. The oldest of them, Ta and Ra, reigned for periods so long that their epochs were measured not in seasons, but in cosmic cycles. To the Egyptians, these ages of shining ones preceded the dynasties of human kings, much as the antediluvian monarchs preceded the realms of Sumer. And when the Nile's floods returned each year, erasing and renewing all, the Egyptians too saw the signature of an old renewal, a miniature echo of that primordial balance between life, death, and rebirth, first set by their celestial rulers. Far to the east, Chinese chronicles tell of the 3 august ones and 5 emperors, sage kings whose lifespans stretched over tens of thousands of years. The Yellow Emperor, Huangdi, reigned for almost a century according to later records. Yet myths grant him eons. He was inventor, healer, astronomer, and poet, a cultural architect instead of a conqueror. Like Enki or Thoth, he symbolizes knowledge descending from the heavens to teach harmony. Chinese lore calls these leaders the ones who restored order after chaotic floods, repeating again the motif of catastrophe followed by recreation. Across the ocean, the Maya and later the Aztec chroniclers preserved lists in which early divine lords existed in cycles measured by suns, not years. Each sun lasted thousands of years before destruction swept the world clean, by jaguars, by wind, by fire, by flood, making room for the next age. In these mythic calendars, the line between ruler and epoch dissolves. Every age had its presiding power, and that power was described as person, number, and time all at once. The same mental architecture that created Sumer's King List governed them, a desire to weave continuity from chaos through the image of enduring rule. The Hebrew Torah and its older oral traditions also join this lineage. The genealogies before the flood of Noah name patriarchs who lived just shy of 1,000 years each: Adam, Seth, Methuselah, echoing Sumer's impossible reigns, almost as if the memory had been translated rather than invented anew. The story of creation, decline, and flood carries unmistakable fingerprints of Mesopotamia. Whether through trade routes or the slow drift of travelers telling stories at riverbanks, these myths fertilized one another. By the time they reached the Levant, the immortal kings had become righteous ancestors whose long lives symbolized proximity to divine perfection and the steady retreat of heaven from earth. What links all these tales are not shared politics or geography, but shared psychology. Civilizations separated by oceans arrived at the same solution for the mystery of beginnings. Greatness must stem from eternity. If the world is ordered and predictable, then its first rulers must have been reflections of the stars themselves. Ancient, patient, unending, each culture reformulated that ideal into its own imagery, but sang the same song about the harmony between cosmic cycles and earthly kings. In every instance, the long-lived rulers mark a threshold, the boundary where divinity becomes human and history begins. They are the mathematical precision of the cosmos translated into flesh, the dream that authority and rhythm can coexist forever. When priests, chroniclers, and poets inked their lists of shining monarchs, they were trying to reassure themselves that time, though merciless, had once been benevolent and might be again. Across deserts and jungles, in hieroglyphs and pictographs, the myth of ageless kings whispers a single promise: that brief as our lives may be, the pattern we serve continues unbroken, traced in the same constellations that guided those who ruled before. The rivers had names. As centuries passed and new kingdoms rose from the mud of old foundations, the world of the immortal rulers began to look embarrassing. The first Sumerian city-states fractured and regrouped into empires. Power shifted from Eridu and Kish to Ur, from Ur to Babylon. Clay tablets containing the grand old tales still sat in temple archives, but the scribes who copied them began to alter the slopes of time. A king who had once ruled for tens of thousands of years was suddenly reduced to a far humbler span, hundreds than mere decades. The divine arithmetic of the ancients no longer suited the ambitions of the living. Bureaucracy had discovered history, and with it came the urge to edit. On one level, the changes seemed practical. How could administrators keep accurate genealogies or tax records when their ancestors supposedly reigned during the glacial epochs? To govern efficiently, the world had to shrink to human proportions. So in the copies written during the dynasties of Essene and Larsa, the lists are corrected, numbers are rounded down, impossible ages excised. The grand cosmic cycles that once described the heartbeat of heaven become tidy chronologies that could fit into scrolls and archives. The priests of Enlil became accountants of the crown. The first historian's red pen was a wedge-shaped stylus pressed into wet clay. But behind the practicality lurked politics. The heroes of the deep past, those luminous, half-divine rulers, were rivals in memory to the monarchs now ruling the land. As new kings sought legitimacy, they could not have their thunder stolen by gods who predated them by 200,000 years. The old immortals had to be humanized, their reigns shortened until they appeared merely ancestral rather than celestial. To honor them excessively was to imply that current kings were pale shadows of lost brilliance. So chroniclers dutifully rebalanced the narrative. The divine descended into myth. The myth was folded into manageable history. The record was secured under royal authority. Tablet by tablet, the past was flattened. Perhaps those early editors did not think of it as censorship, only accuracy. Yet what they created was a new breed of truth, one trimmed to serve administration. History no longer belonged to the storytellers or priests who gazed at stars. It belonged to scribes in palace schools trained to honor the ruler's version of reality. The act of shortening divine reigns drew a line in time itself, dividing myth from record. It was civilization's first quiet admission that myth could be edited, that authority over the past was as valuable as authority over land. In royal archives at Babylon, copies of the King List were curated as tools of legitimacy. Dynasties claimed descent from its line selectively, omitting competitors and exaggerating their own duration, adjusting reigns to make their forebears appear ordained by the very gods they had reduced to fables. The irony was exquisite. Kings who no longer believed in immortals still borrowed their glow. When scribes wrote that kingship once again descended from heaven to sanctify a new ruler, they were reusing words that had once described miracles. Over time, the sculpted versions of history became self-sustaining. Schoolchildren memorized them. Priests recited them in ceremonies of continuity. Clay tablets baked in the kiln hardened these revisions into eternity. The ageless kings faded beneath fresher names: Sargon, Hammurabi, Nebuchadnezzar. Men who ruled not epochs, but empires, whose deeds, not their lifespans, were meant to touch eternity. Yet even in their zeal to tidy the past, the bureaucrats could not entirely silence it. Some late copies of the King List still preserve the ancient numbers, faint ghosts that slip through the cracks of censors' logic. In those surviving fragments, the voice of the mythic world remains. Quiet, improbable, defiant. They remind us that history, no matter how often rewritten, still carries echoes of what refuses to fit. Somewhere beneath the orderly tablets and catalogued dynasties, the immortal kings linger, not erased, but dreaming, waiting for the next archaeologist's brush to free them from the clay once again. At the center of Eridu's oldest temple, among the baked bricks kissed by millennia of dust, archaeologists found traces of a small channel that once carried water through the floor. It wasn't plumbing. It was symbolism. Living proof that this house was dedicated to Enki, the god of wisdom and of the deep, who ruled over the subterranean freshwaters called the Abzu. For the Sumerians, water was the metaphor for thought itself. Fluid, shaping, powerful enough to carve stone, gentle enough to nourish life. To them, knowledge flowed like a current, and Enki was the spring from which it came. In the myths, Enki's generosity is both salvation and danger. It is he who molds humans from clay, mixing the wet earth of the Abzu with divine intention, teaching them language and craft. He shows them how to measure fields, how to dig canals, how to sing respectfully to the gods so that storms and drought do not tear their fragile civilization apart. Knowledge is his gift, but it is also his weapon, for what once belonged solely to the gods now runs freely in human hands. The great paradox of wisdom is born. The moment it is shared, it can no longer be controlled. The King List can be read as the echo of this gift. Those who reigned for thousands of years are often described in hymns as keepers of Enki's secrets. Their long dominion is not literal longevity, but symbolic endurance. A king's body fades, yet if he guards Enki's knowledge, how to balance irrigation with flood, how to record justice on clay. His influence stretches through generations. In that sense, wisdom becomes another form of immortality. The scribe's stylus, inspired by Enki's flowing craft, lasts longer than any sword. Writing itself was regarded as sacred current, the physical manifestation of truth moving from the divine into the human realm. Each wedge pressed into soft clay was like ripples across the water, carrying thought beyond the boundaries of mortal life. The act of recording names and deeds was never just bookkeeping. It was a ritual affirming that knowledge could defy death. When later kings sought legitimacy, they didn't build only monuments. They built archives. They understood, even if dimly, that the possession of information granted a power greater than armies. The ability to shape memory. Enki's mythology preserves another thread of warning. In one tale, he keeps the me, the sacred formulas of civilization, locked away until the goddess Inanna cunningly extracts them, scattering their blessings and their burdens across humankind. The story reads almost like a premonition of progress. Wisdom cannot be confined. Once shared, it multiplies. Every invention drags consequences behind it. To the Sumerians, that theft was not blasphemy, but fulfillment of purpose. Even the gods understood that knowledge must flow outward or stagnate. As the centuries turned and the immortal reigns of myth faded into the chronicles of mortal kings, Enki's current kept running unseen beneath the surface. Each school of scribes, each temple of learning, was an eddy of that divine stream. A child learning to press characters into clay became, however briefly, a vessel for a power older than cities. That lineage outlasted dynasties. When empires fell, their libraries, their accumulated wisdom, often survived in pieces, carried onward by conquerors who would in turn be conquered. The human story became a chain of borrowed sparks from the same primordial flame. Perhaps that is the real secret hidden in the King List. Its impossible years hint not at physical eternity, but at continuity of understanding. As long as minds inherit the lessons of those before them, the reign of wisdom never ends. The kings die, the temples crumble, but knowledge continues to flow, patient as groundwater, rising again whenever new hands carve new tablets. That is Enki's gift and his warning. To hold it is to borrow a fragment of immortality, but also to bear its weight, knowing that what we learn always outlives us, reshaping the world long after our own names have dissolved back into clay. Among the most intimate mysteries of Mesopotamia are not the tablets or ziggurats that time expected to survive, but the smaller, stranger things that were never meant to endure. The tools, the ornaments, and the fragments of craftsmanship so precise that they seem to whisper of forgotten sciences. In museum cases, they lie under soft light, polished as though the centuries had only dusted them, not buried them. A copper scalpel with an edge still fierce enough to catch the finger's ridge. Stone dishes carved so thin they ring like glass when lightly tapped. A lens of pure rock crystal, ground into convex perfection by hands without modern machines. When archaeologists first unearthed such objects, they did what scholars do best. They argued. Some saw nothing but coincidence of skill, the inevitable result of talented artisans experimenting over generations. Others, however, felt a pulse of déjà vu, as though these artifacts belonged to a technological language we have only half learned to translate. Were they mundane tools of their era, or survivors from a deeper past? Echoes of crafts destroyed by the very flood that the King List calls the divide between gods and men? Consider the so-called astronomical cups. bowls dotted with constellations, their shallow indentations matching star patterns visible to modern telescopes. Were they ceremonial, or did they function as primitive sky maps used by the temple astronomers? And what of the tiny drill holes found in diorite and basalt? Stones so hard that modern diamond bits struggle to pierce them. Their symmetry defies explanation by simple hand labor. Artisans of Sumer and Akkad may not have had motors, but they understood vibration, leverage, and rhythm. Their craft teeters indistinguishably between art and engineering. If Enki was the guardian of knowledge, then perhaps these objects were the sediment of his teachings, a technology not lost by accident, but buried by necessity, when floods and empire collapses wipe the slate of memory clean. Myths speak of sages before the flood, the Apkallu, semi-divine beings who taught agriculture, architecture, mathematics, and medicine. The ancient texts insist these sages lived in the courts of the antediluvian kings, departing only when the deluge descended. Could their legend trace back to real inventors, their innovations calcified into myth as literacy shrank, and generations forgot the mechanisms but remembered the marvels? Every civilization inherits gaps in its own memory. When modern engineers examine the intricate bronze gears of the Antikythera mechanism from Greece or the prehistoric stone spheres of Costa Rica, they confront the same sense of temporal vertigo that the scholars of Mesopotamia felt before those polished lenses and uncanny carvings. Humanity rediscovers. We never invent in isolation. In that way, even the strangest tool becomes another kind of text, one written not in cuneiform, but in precision, testifying that the pursuit of mastery over matter is as old as awe itself. It may be that the genius of these creations was entirely human, born from endless patience and the guidance of mathematics already flourishing under temple tutors. Yet, acknowledging their sophistication forces us to reconsider how thin the border truly was between mythic and empirical minds. A craftsman etching constellations into a bowl was not worshipping stars. He was recording data. The priest who mixed herbs by weight instead of intuition was performing an early chemistry. Step by step, moment by moment, myth and measurement converged in bronze and clay. In the soft hum of museum air, staring at those fragments of impossible precision, one feels both humility and unease. These were not the toys of a primitive world, but messages from an intelligence very much like ours, curious, mischievous, and unwilling to settle for mystery without experiment. If myths remember a time before the flood, when gods and humans worked side by side, perhaps they are simply recalling the first moment humanity learned to imitate creation not with prayers, but with tools. The tailor of stone and metal was another kind of priest, and his altar was the workshop. What he crafted was faith made tangible, proof that in shaping matter to our will, we echo the divine impulse itself. After the flood, time itself seemed to contract. The long reigns of the antediluvian kings, measured in impossible thousands of years, gave way to the modest scales of mortal life. Where once a ruler's throne carried the weight of cosmic order, now it bore the more ordinary burden of keeping crops alive and borders respected. In this shrinking of ages, humanity crossed a threshold as profound as the deluge itself, the moment when kings became men and history began to replace eternity. The change can be read right on the tablets. After the final line naming Ubaratutu, last of the ancient monarchs, follow new entries marked not by SARS and NIRS, but decades. Then kingship was taken back down from heaven and established in Kish. The language shifts subtly but decisively. The throne no longer descends from the divine realm as pure miracle, but reemerges among people who must prove themselves through lineage and achievement. Those who rule now do so by inheritance, marriage, conquest, or favor, not by birth among the stars. For the first time, politics replaces cosmology. Yet traces of the divine lingered within this new realism. The earliest post-flood kings still claimed blessings from Anu or Enlil, but they stood as mediators rather than incarnations. The temple remained beside the palace, just as priestly. Council remained beside the throne. But the old certainty of godhood in flesh had evaporated like mist. The people could see their rulers eat, age, and die. Their mortality as visible as their crowns. Perhaps it brought comfort. Perhaps it brought loneliness. In surrendering immortality, humanity also surrendered the illusion that perfection walked among them. Archaeological layers record this transition with quiet precision. The opulent temples of Eridu gave way to more practical cities like Kish and Uruk, whose remains show administration, accounting tablets, standardized weights, bureaucratic seals. The divine language of myth had transformed into the practical grammar of governance. Where once kingship was measured in harmony with the heavens, it was now measured in harvest yields and the lengths of canals. In clay archives, the stylist no longer inscribed hymns to eternity, but lists of livestock and workers. What the flood had washed away was not merely land, but the psychological distance between gods and mortals. The anthropologists who sift through these layers describe the shift as the birth of accountability. When rulers could no longer claim eternity, they had to justify themselves in the present. The old mandate of heaven became conditional upon performance. Justice, no longer a cosmic abstraction, became law. Kings were praised when irrigation flowed, vilified when famine struck. Temples still anointed them, but the anointing oil only shimmered as long as order was maintained. The divine right evolved into a social contract. Still, nostalgia for the eternal bled through every coronation ritual. In the hymns to newly crowned kings of Ur, priests chanted the same refrain once sung for the ancient immortals. His shadow is long upon the earth, his voice carries to the heavens. The hyperbole was part ceremony, part yearning. Even as humanity accepted mortality, it refused to abandon the hope that certain lives might brush against infinity. In that longing lay the seed of heroism, the belief that deeds could outlast flesh, even if bodies could not. Thus began the age of remembered kings rather than immortal ones. Gilgamesh of Uruk would rise to embody both sides of the divide. A mortal obsessed with reclaiming the immortality that mythology had just taken away. Through him and others, the myths learned to wear human faces again. From this blend of regret and realism, civilization deepened. The gods remained overhead, but their conversation partners were no longer divine monarchs. They were ambitious, flawed, thinking beings whose power came not from eternity, but from imagination. The age of the immortal kings ended. But in their passing they had taught humanity its most enduring lesson, that the desire to rule is fleeting, but the desire to be remembered is what truly defies time. When the waters finally receded from the plains of Mesopotamia and the rivers found calmer banks, the survivors began to build again. Among the first cities to rise from the newly settled earth was Kish, a modest cluster at first, but destined to become the heart of a reborn world. The King List tells us that after the Great Flood, kingship was established in Kish. The phrase marks a pivot in human story. Leadership now re-emerges not from heaven's descent, but from human gathering, from the simple, desperate need to restore order amid loss. Civilization had drowned, and Kish became its second breath. Archaeologists walking its ruins describe a city born in confidence. Within a few generations, mud brick huts gave way to broad temples and fortified walls, the kind of architecture that announces ambition. Shards of writing appear in abundance. Each stylus stroke a heartbeat of returning complexity. Tablets from early Kish list rations of grain to workers, records of trade caravans, and the first hints of taxation. Bureaucracy, for better or worse, was civilization's revenge on chaos. Every mark in clay declared the people were trying to remeasure time, reclaiming what the deluge had erased. The kings of Kish were remembered not for mystical ages, but for practical might. Names like Itani, Enmebaragesi, and Aga appear with the weight of realism. Their reigns confined to decades, their deeds to battles and alliances rather than cosmic balance. Itani, in a myth preserved on much later tablets, is called the shepherd who ascended to heaven. His story fuses new humanity with old mythology. A mortal king yearning to touch the sky, symbol of mankind's renewed ambition to bridge earth and divine. Though on the surface it reads as legend, within its lines lies the psychological truth of the age. After the trauma of near annihilation, humanity sought reassurance that it could still reach upward. Kish's sudden rise was not gentle. Excavations reveal fortifications thick enough to withstand siege, and arrowheads embedded in the layers of its earliest streets. The survivors who rebuilt Mesopotamia did so among rival clans, each city clamoring to claim divine sanction as the rightful heir of the drowned world. Conflict became the new reign, predictable and destructive, but also fertile in its own way. War forged diplomacy. Victory demanded administration. Conquest created infrastructure. Out of this friction, the idea of empire was born, not as tyranny yet, but as the realization that scattered cities could be bound by shared authority and shared memory. In the archives of Kish, small clay envelopes sealed with cylinder impressions tell of treaties and contracts. These seals, rolling ornate designs across the surface of soft clay, depict scenes of gods and heroes, but served a thoroughly earthly function: authentication, legitimacy, trust between trading partners. The cosmic language of the old kings turned into currency and law. Every emblem pressed into clay was both artwork and signature, representing the flowering of literacy into politics. The divine voice that once proclaimed kingship now whispered from a bureaucrat's tablet. As Kish reached outward, sending emissaries and armies across the flood-scarred lands, its influence rippled into every aspect of Sumerian life. Canals linked towns like veins, trade routes carried tin, lapis lazuli, and ideas from distant plateaus. What had been a scattered patchwork of settlements became a network pulsing with ambition. Civilization was no longer rebuilding what had been lost. It was surpassing it. Yet beneath that triumph, the memory of the flood lingered. Each new city wall was more than defense. It was reassurance against another rising tide. Each regulation carved in clay was faith that order could be permanent. The kings of Kish ruled not in imitation of the gods, but in defiance of the catastrophe that had tried to erase humanity. Out of trauma, they built momentum, and from momentum, the first empire. It was not immortality this time, but endurance, a subtler, sturdier legacy that would carry their names further than any divine reign. As cities like Kish rose from the receding mud of the floodplain, the written word rose with them, shaping not only government, but a new way of thinking about existence itself. What had begun as marks to count sacks of grain and tally workers matured into a full language capable of containing philosophy, prayer, and mathematics. The soft clay tablets covered every surface of life. contracts, hymns, omens, and measurements of the stars. The scribes who created them were not mere record keepers. They were the alchemists of meaning, transforming sound and thought into permanence, taking what was fleeting and pinning it to eternity. Cuneiform, born from the stylus pressed into wet clay, was more than convenience. It was ideology. By solidifying words, the Sumerians believed they were helping the gods impose structure on the chaos that flooded every border of life. The universe, after all, had nearly drowned them once. Anything that could fix time or knowledge in physical form was sacred insurance against oblivion. Each tablet became a small defiance of erasure, a promise that what was learned would not vanish with the next flood or the next forgetful generation. To write was itself a ritual act. Before beginning, the scribe prayed to Nisaba, goddess of writing and measurement, asking for a steady hand and a true mind. The stylus, sharpened reed dipped in water, carried echoes of Enki's own element, a symbolic descendant of the deep waters of creation. The gesture of inscribing resembled planting. Each wedge in clay looked like a seed pressed into soil. As the tablets dried in the sun, knowledge hardened into reality. Myths, laws, and calendars took shape, and the corners of the known world grew more distinct with every line. By the 3rd millennium BCE, the system of writing had grown so intricate that entire schools were devoted to mastering its grammar. Young scribes sat cross-legged in temple courtyards, copying lists of kings, trades, and celestial bodies under the watchful eye of masters. The process served more than education. It trained obedience to order itself. Every student of cuneiform learned that language could carve boundaries around chaos, that the world could be counted, named, and categorized. Writing did not just record civilization. It taught civilization how to see. The tablets turned time into architecture. Years could now be stacked like bricks, each record continuing the line of another. By listing reigns, the Sumerians discovered chronology. By noting the shape of the moon and the path of Venus, they created astronomy. The act of inscribing annual cycles made those cycles predictable. With that predictability came power. Crops, taxes, wars, all could now be planned in dialogue with the heavens. The priest astronomers who read the skies could check their observations against written precedent, slowly converting divine mystery into calculable rhythm. The cosmos became a set of records, and by extension, a set of laws. The more humans wrote, the more divine writing itself became. The gods, too, were imagined as scribes of fate. Enlil kept a tablet of destinies. The goddess Nisaba tallied stars as she did words. The universe was envisioned as a colossal archive, everything done by gods or mortals written in an infinite ledger of clay. Even death could not escape bookkeeping. The underworld maintained its own scrolls of names. Nothing unrecorded truly existed. In the rhythmic press of stylus to clay, the Sumerians found a theology that still lives in every calendar, ledger, and notebook today. To record was to make real. To measure was to maintain cosmic equilibrium. Each tablet drying in the heat was another wall against disorder, a reminder that permanence can be built one mark at a time. The first writing may have begun as humble accounting, but it ended as a blueprint for the human soul's oldest desire: to capture chaos, to give it shape and name, and to inscribe our brief lives on the endless tablet of the world. For anyone who has ever stared at the impossible arithmetic of the Sumerian King List, the 241,000 years compressed into the rule of only 8 kings, the temptation to see more than fantasy is irresistible. Historians, mathematicians, and dreamers have all tried to decode it, to find an underlying rhythm in the strangeness. What if, they ask, the numbers were never meant to describe lifespans at all? What if those vast stretches of reigns encode something greater than humanity, something written in the motion of the heavens themselves? When modern researchers translated the figures into sexagesimal terms, the Sumerian base 60 system that still dictates our hours and degrees, a hidden structure began to glimmer. Each reign divides neatly into multiples of 60 or of 3600, the Sar. The entire pre-flood era adds up to 241,200 years, if counted line by line, or roughly 67 Sars. The mathematical symmetry is too clean to be coincidence. The figures look deliberate, a sequence of celestial intervals masquerading as biography. Perhaps, scholars proposed, each king represented not a person, but a cosmic phase, a rule of the heavens. From that vantage, the King List reads less like genealogy and more like an astronomical treatise disguised for sanctuaries rather than observatories. The ancients might have expressed their grasp of cosmic cycles in mythic language that ordinary worshippers could understand. Each divine reign symbolized a stretch of time governed by a particular alignment of planets or constellations. Eras in which one celestial body dominated the calendar before yielding to the next. Some physicists, intrigued by the overlap, compared those reign lengths with the great precessional cycle, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that completes itself roughly every 25,900 years. If the Sumerians recognized even a fragment of that pattern, something hinted at in later Babylonian star catalogs, they may have multiplied their sacred numbers to describe precession in the units most meaningful to them. 28,800 years, Alulim's allotted rule, is astonishingly close to a rounded precessional arc calculated in base 60 notation. The coincidence ignited speculation that their mythic chronologies were early attempts to chart kingship of the heavens. Epochs when different stars rose at the equinox as markers of celestial governance. Within temple schools, such correlations would not have seemed alien. The priests already treated numbers as divine language. To them, mathematics was a form of prophecy, a bridge between the evident world and its invisible order. If cosmic motion could be mapped in equations, then human rule must reflect that geometry. Kingship on Earth became a mirror of cycles above. Each generation recited the names of its rulers as though invoking coordinates in time. Even the total, 241,000 years, invites metaphor. Divided by the 60-year cycle that defined the full rotation of calendar signs, and the result neatly rounds out to about 4,000 essential cycles. The number of years separating ancient Sumer from our own modern reckoning of civilization's dawn. To the open-minded, such parallels feel like fingerprints of design. To the skeptical, they are numerical coincidence elevated to mysticism. But regardless of belief, the pattern demonstrates the Sumerians' instinct to view measurement as theology. The deeper researchers dig, the more the King List resembles a code. History, religion, and astronomy compressed into narrative. Whether intended or accidental, those numbers speak the same language that underpins later sacred chronologies. Egyptian king lists, Buddhist kalpas, and even biblical genealogies. All efforts to embody infinite time in finite figures. The Sumerians may have been the first to formalize that impulse, weaving their awareness of cosmic rhythm into myth so tightly that later generations remembered only the story, not the science within it. Seen from that angle, the 241,000 years cease to be absurd. They become a celestial spreadsheet rendered in poetry, a symbolic chart of how the world recycles itself. The kings before the flood did not live forever. They marked forever, translating the spin of stars into human language. In their numbers survives a quiet reminder that mathematics, at its oldest, was never meant merely to count. It was meant to worship. Beneath the vaulted language of empires and gods, beneath the lists of kings whose reigns spanned millennia, there are voices that never expected an audience. Thousands of tablets dug from the ruins of Sumer are not chronicles of immortal rulers or cosmic floods, but something simpler and infinitely more intimate, the correspondence of ordinary life. When archaeologists open those tablets, the tone changes. Myth gives way to heartbeat. Etched in drying clay are grocery lists, complaints about lazy apprentices, love songs whispered through cuneiform. They are the margins of myth, the human breath that kept the great machinery of divine history running. A merchant in Ur writes to his partner in Kish, "The copper arrived in poor condition. You promised good metal. Do not force me to shame you before the guild." His sharp words, 4,000 years old, feel startlingly present. A mother sends a message to her son serving in a temple. "Do not forget your bread. Sleep under your cloak, not in the open air." She closes with the blessing, "May Inanna guard you through the night." Between those wedges of clay, gods and humanity share the same page, one as invocation, the other as longing. Many of the letters carry the rhythm of practical survival. Debts noted, deliveries tallied, wages promised, all sealed with the roll of a cylinder image showing divine scenes of order and protection. To write about barley storage or the purchase of sheep was to participate in cosmic stability, because every transaction mirrored the heavenly accounting imagined on tablets of destiny held by the gods. For the scribes and citizens of Sumer, there was no gap between the sacred and the mundane. Recording a bushel of grain was a quiet prayer for continuation. Other tablets sing rather than measure. Hymns recovered from Nippur and Lagash do not praise rulers of impossible age, but celebrate simple blessings. Irrigation after drought, safe births, moonlight on the canals. One poem addressed to Enheduanna, a priestess and perhaps the world's first named author, pulses with personal devotion. "Lady of countless charms, your words fill the temple as wine fills a cup." Hers is a woman's voice in a world thick with royal proclamations, and through it we glimpse the emotional spine of Sumerian life, a combination of piety and sensuality, reverence for gods, that is, also reverence for the texture of living. Even receipts and tax slips hum with personality. A scribe sometimes doodled a fish or carved a flourish at the tablet's corner, the cuneiform equivalent of a signature flourish. One student scribe, caught copying too slowly, left a tablet half-finished with a note from his teacher scratched into the wet clay. "Why are you idle? The reed waits." His hurry and frustration leap centuries without effort. In the clay archives of temples, voices overlap like river ripples. Priests dictating hymns, traders negotiating shipments, officials auditing harvests. The sum of their voices reveals that the age of mythical kings was lived by flesh and blood people who laughed, quarreled, and feared taxes as much as floods. They did not see themselves as backdrops to divine spectacle. They saw divinity threaded through their daily tasks. When those tablets harden under the sun, they cross an invisible boundary. What was once fleeting thought becomes artifact. What was once private becomes eternal. Each one holds a moment. Someone clearing their throat on a dusty afternoon, pressing words into mud so that another would remember. Those were the true immortals of Sumer, not the kings whose reigns stretch beyond reason, but the ordinary hands that left fingerprints at the edges of tablets. Their small messages, born of barter and affection, have survived fire, invasion, and oblivion. In those faint indentations, the ancient world stops being legend and begins to speak again, soft and familiar, in the universal tone of daily life. The city of Eridu, cradle of all the myths, did not die in a single catastrophe, but in a slow and weary fading, like the dimming of an oil lamp whose wick has burned too low. Centuries of silt, salt, and shifting rivers conspired against it. The once bright canals that carried life from the Euphrates began to clog. Fields grew white with salinity. Reeds gave way to dust. The temple of Enki, which had ruled for millennia as the axis of faith and wisdom, stood amid retreating waters, its ceremonial basin cracked and empty. The old capital of creation became a ghost of itself, and the people drifted northward, following the river's unpredictable heart. Out of that drift rose Uruk, a city that would take the spiritual inheritance of Eridu and reforge it into something new. At first, it was just another settlement, feeding off the fertile floodplains and the trade routes that had begun to lace Sumer together like stitching in a vast fabric. But Uruk was quick to learn the language of expansion. As Eridu's priests clung to memory, Uruk's builders embraced momentum. They laid bricks faster, built higher, recorded more. Their walls, gleaming in the sun, stretched for miles, a defiant boundary against wilderness and time. Uruk became not merely a city, but an idea. Humanity magnified. Here the myth of the divine king returned in half measure, carved into flesh, yet tempered by human flaw. Legend placed Gilgamesh on its throne, 2/3 God and 1/3 man, an arithmetic of contradiction that made perfect sense to a people standing between heaven and earth. In him, the age of immortal kings finally merged with the age of history. The story that bears his name, written centuries later, carries within it the echo of Eridu's fall, the anxiety of a world realizing that it must save itself. Gilgamesh builds walls, catalogs the city's treasures, tames the wilderness beyond its gates, yet he cannot tame time. His great journey to find eternal life is simply the Sumerian soul chasing the vanished shimmer of divine perfection. Where Al-Ulim and Al-Algar had been beyond death, Gilgamesh must look death in the face. In his struggle, myth evolves from cosmic order into psychological truth. Immortality is not in years, but in remembrance. Uruk's rise was not peaceful. The same restless drive that built its walls also fueled its ambitions. Tablets record wars with Kish and Umma, alliances that shifted like the riverbeds themselves. For the first time, written history documents victory marches, tribute lists, and the politics of expansion. The Sumerian world had become self-aware, aware of its ironies. The more it tried to preserve itself through writing and monuments, the more it revealed its mortality. Archaeologists excavating Uruk's layers find evidence of both greatness and exhaustion. Here are administrative archives by the hundreds, records of beer rations for workers, of copper shipments from the east, of temple staff rotations. Here, too, are layers of ash, where invaders struck or rebellion torched the streets. Each phase rises directly upon the ruin of the last, continuity born of destruction. Civilization was learning its new rhythm: growth, collapse, renewal. In the long memory of Mesopotamia, Eridu's name would survive as legend, spoken in ritual as the first city of the gods. But Uruk would carry the torch of humanity. Its gods were still powerful, yet its heroes were recognizably human. Builders, poets, dreamers haunted by the brevity of their kind. When scribes scratched the closing lines of the Epic of Gilgamesh, they invoked not the heavens, but the walls of Uruk as proof of glory. The power once anchored in temples had transferred to the imagination. Thus, the fall of Eridu was not an ending, but a transformation, the moment when divinity ceded its throne to human endeavor, and myth stepped down into history, shading softly into the mortal world. The tale of Gilgamesh begins within the walls he built, a city wrapped around the bones of forgotten ages, where the dust of gods mingled with the footprints of merchants and soldiers. Uruk's walls were his glory and his prison. Proud, restless, and brilliant, Gilgamesh walked atop them, gazing at the endless plains beyond, haunted by the feeling that something irretrievable had slipped through the fingers of humankind. He was the child of a mortal woman and a divine ancestor, a figure poised between two worlds, carrying the weight of both. In his heart lived the ancient memory of the immortal kings and the growing awareness that those days had drowned under the flood of time. When the epic of Gilgamesh was finally inscribed centuries later, its story shimmered with grief older than the lines themselves. It was not just the lament of one man who feared death. It was the collective yearning of a civilization that remembered dimly the age when humans and gods inhabited the same horizon. The poem unfolds as a meditation on loss disguised as adventure. Gilgamesh begins as tyrant, half divinity, certain that his strength places him above consequence. But the gods send Enkidu, wild man of the plains, to temper his arrogance. Their friendship becomes the first recorded bond of equals in literature, and it changes everything. Through companionship, Gilgamesh becomes human. Through loss, he becomes wise. When Enkidu dies, struck down by divine decree, the fleet arrogance of Uruk's king collapses. He stares at his friend's still body and sees, perhaps for the first time, the fate that awaits every man. The immortal lineage he had boasted no longer shields him. The hero's wail echoes across the poem. Must I die too? Must Gilgamesh be like Enkidu? No myth reveals more clearly the turning point of Sumerian thought, the surrender of literal eternal life to the search for meaning within its limits. The burden of mortality, born from the fading of the immortal monarchs, becomes the new canvas of spirituality. Gilgamesh sets out on his desperate quest to find Utnapishtim, the soul man granted immortality after surviving the Great Flood. His journey leads across mountains of dawn and through the waters of death, a psychological map of humanity's longing to reverse the verdict written at Genesis. When at last Gilgamesh reaches Utnapishtim, the old survivor tells him the truth no hero wishes to hear. The gods have reserved immortality for themselves. Life and death are the boundaries that make the human story possible. Even when Gilgamesh finds a miraculous plant of renewal, it slips from his grasp, stolen by a serpent. A gesture so symbolic, it seems the world itself is conspiring to make him accept fragility as law. He returns to Uruk with nothing in his hands but wisdom and memory. Yet the poet ends not in tragedy, but in quiet triumph. Standing once more before the city's immense walls, Gilgamesh invites the listener to look upon their perfection, to see in human creation the only immortality attainable. The walls stand for legacy, the effort to leave something behind, to carve permanence out of impermanence. It is a nobler, humbler eternity than Alulim's imagined 28,800 years, but more truthful. Through this story, the Sumerians confessed their own transformation. Having lost their divine kings and their dream of endless reigns, they turned to the soul's endurance, to love, friendship, artistry, and record as substitutes for literal immortality. Humanity's sorrow became its genius, its awareness of death, the engine of creativity. Gilgamesh failed to live forever, and in that failure he became the first human hero in the truest sense. One who knows he will die but builds anyway, who feels grief and still creates. The poem that bears his name outlasted empires, carried on shards of clay. In that endurance we find the sly victory the hero sought. Proof that while flesh decays, stories do not. The walls of Uruk may crumble, but the words about them remain, whispering across ages that immortality was never about living without end, but about leaving behind something that still can speak. The more completely scholars uncover the clay, the more the ancient stories appear both true and untrue at once. The early explorers of Mesopotamia arrived chasing tales of the Bible, the Tower of Babel, the Flood, the Garden of Eden. What they found instead were personal letters and rusty hoes, ledgers of barley and broken figurines, evidence of people too ordinary to fit in myth. Yet mixed among these fragments were objects and layers that seemed to echo those same legendary patterns. It was as though the real and the imagined were married in the very soil, daring scientists to separate them grain by grain. Modern archaeology brought its discipline to bear on the myths. Radiocarbon dating of charcoal in ancient foundations offered a chronology rooted in physics rather than poetry. The calculations told a humbler story. The earliest settlements at Eridu, around 5400 BCE. The swift spread of urban life by 3500 BCE. The invention of writing soon after. Statistically, no 241,000-year dynasty could hide inside such a brief window. Civilization, as measured in hearth ash and pottery shards, unfolded in mere millennia rather than aeons. To many researchers, this was satisfying, even comforting. It placed humanity back within understandable limits. Sediment analysis corroborated the numbers, yet it also reignited the fascination with catastrophe. In the 1920s, the British archaeologist Leonard Woolley excavated layers at Ur and stumbled upon something extraordinary. Deep beneath the city streets, he found an 8-foot stratum of clean silt, evidence of a flood so immense it erased everything before it. Radiocarbon testing later dated it to roughly 2900 BCE, eerily close to the traditional era of the Sumerian flood stories. The deposit was local, not global, but it proved that something like the myth had happened. A single city's disaster became magnified through generations, retold until it drowned the entire world. Science, in effect, had found the seed that myth watered into legend. Population studies further clarified the picture. Genetic traces in modern Near Eastern peoples show a continuity stretching back to those earliest farmers who settled along the Tigris and Euphrates. The numbers suggest no sudden alien infusion, no lost race of divine kings. Each generation descended from the same local stock, adapting to agricultural life. Yet even in this continuity lie small riddles, pockets of unexplained innovation, sudden irrigational leaps that outpaced known technology. How did the earliest builders of canals achieve such precision without precedent? Some archaeologists invoke trial and error. Others quietly suspect forgotten experiments, a vanished cycle of development. The more instruments we apply, microscopes, isotopic spectroscopy, satellite mapping, the more human the Sumerians become, and paradoxically, the grander their imagination seems. Their myths correspond uncannily with real geology and meteorology. The flood is visible in sediment. The changing constellations that influence their temples are still predictable today. The destruction of Eridu aligns with measurable salinization of the soil and diverted rivers. The gods' tempers were simply environmental data translated into drama. In peeling back the legends, science does not debunk them. It reveals the psychological truth inside their exaggeration. And yet, anomalies remain like small, persistent lights in a dark field. Radiocarbon calibration curves wobble unpredictably in some Mesopotamian samples, shifting dates by centuries. Artifacts occasionally surface out of sequence, advanced craftsmanship appearing before the context that should have produced it. Lenses cut from crystal at Nimrud, bronze alloys too uniform to have been smelted in simple furnaces. Their exact methods remain elusive. Each oddity keeps the thrill alive, the sense that knowledge always withholds a fraction of itself. A wink from the past, reminding us that the first scientists were also dreamers. When archaeologists step away from their trenches at dusk, they often confess to a strange dual respect. The physics beneath their feet proves the myths mortal, but the persistence of those stories, still shining after 6,000 years, defies extinction. The king lists, the flood, the divine architects, none are literally true, yet all were accurate in spirit, translating human awe into the only language capable of surviving time. Each new discovery tightens the boundaries of history and simultaneously widens the aperture of wonder, leaving us exactly where the Sumerians began. Standing between measured earth and imagined heaven, still trying to read the secrets written in mud. As the mechanical precision of modern dating sorted the layers of dirt into calendars and centuries, another kind of scientist, part philosopher, part mythographer, set about decoding what those timelines might mean beyond the physical. For them, the Sumerian King List was never a document meant to fit inside human chronology. It was a map of heaven written in human form, an astrology disguised as ancestry. What if each king was not flesh and blood at all, but an age of the sky, one ruled by a planet, a constellation, or a celestial crossroad that governed earthly destiny? The more carefully the cuneiform numbers were studied, the more they seemed to pulse with astronomical logic. The Sumerians watched the night world with obsessive devotion. Generations of priests recorded the slow crawl of the zodiac across the heavens, noting how different constellations rose at dawn as centuries turned. The sky was their scripture and their clock. It was inevitable that its subtle revolutions would shape their idea of divine time. Modern comparativists noticed that the 8 kings before the flood, Alulim through Ubaratutu, mirrored 8 major celestial powers in Sumerian belief: the sun, the moon, Venus, Mercury, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and the circumpolar stars that never set. Each celestial body carried personality and mythic biography, perhaps reinterpreted later as the reign of one king. Their immense lengths of rule, counted in tens of thousands of years, may correspond to cycles of the heavens, a cosmic calendar encoded as royal succession. If this reading is right, the King List is not unique at all, but part of a global pattern. The Egyptians cataloged dynasties of gods who ruled before humans, their thrones traced through the motions of the sun and Sirius. The later Greeks described a golden age ruled by Kronos, the same slow-moving planet astronomers now know as Saturn. Across cultures, the rhythm repeats. Divine eras assigned to heavenly rulers. Epochs marked by the changing balance of the sky. The Sumerians simply gave this pattern its most bureaucratic form, turning star time into the tidy columns and numbers of an accountant. Each transfer of kingship from one city to another can also be read as the passage of celestial influence from one constellation to the next. When Eridu yields to Bad Tibira, the horizon of the equinox had shifted. When Bad Tibira cedes to Larak, a new star had risen in seasonal dominance. The reigns of thousands of years were not exaggerations, but necessary measures of cosmic duration. To speak of a planet's rule was to describe the season of reality it governed. For the ancients, the heavens were a living government, with councils and economies of power far more stable than those on Earth. Even the Great Flood fits into this astronomical allegory. It may symbolize not a literal deluge, but a reset of the celestial order. the moment when precession or planetary conjunctions altered the calendar. The flood washed the slate of time clean, after which kingship was taken up again, meaning a new configuration of the heavens began to guide human fate. It is a poetic cosmology that bridges physics and faith. Time not as a line, but as a round river endlessly cycling through stages of divine administration. Modern astronomy can reconstruct the skies of ancient Sumer, and when one compares those reconstructions with the King List structure, correspondences appear tantalizing, if not conclusive. The precision with which early scribes tracked Venus and Jupiter shows that they were perfectly capable of grasping the rhythm of long celestial cycles. They may have translated that grandeur into stories of monarchs reigning in unimaginable epochs simply because myth was more enduring than measurement. A mathematical table can crumble, a legend can travel millennia. Seen in this light, the King List becomes an act of cosmic devotion. Each name in its sequence is a metaphor for the great machinery above the earth, every number a formula for unseen motion. Modern readers search those figures hoping to find hidden data. The Sumerians inscribed them to express harmony, to remind themselves that history on Earth was only the reflection of a deeper chronology unfolding in the stars. The kings may have turned to dust, but the heavens still keep their rotations, patient and eternal, continuing the story they began. In the crumbling heart of Mesopotamia, where dust sifts endlessly through ancient streets, lies the site of Nippur, once the sacred navel of the Sumerian world. Here, archaeologists uncovered one of the earliest libraries known to humankind, a city of clay tablets within a city of brick, where priests guarded knowledge as tightly as kings guarded gold. In the shadow of the great temple of Enlil, thousands of fragile slabs lay packed in layers, each impressed with wedges so small and steady that they seem less written than engineered. The library of Nippur was no archive of leisurely literature. It was machinery, a factory of time. Among the administrative records and hymns, scholars found sequences that at first seemed bewildering. Long columns of numbers, paired with names of constellations, lunar days, and cryptic notations resembling fractional degrees. These were calendars stacked within calendars, a priestly attempt to frame eternity in increments small enough for human use. In their careful calculations of star risings and seasonal shifts, the priests were not merely studying the heavens, they were managing the world below. By predicting when rivers would flood or when offerings must be made, they positioned themselves as the interpreters of divine timing. To control the calendar was to control everyone's hours, harvests, and hopes. In those tablets, time receives its first bureaucratic harness. Lists of festivals tied to lunar cycles dictated when citizens could plant fields or hold markets. Certain days were branded unlucky, others holy, their distinction determined not by experience, but by priestly proclamation. One fragment, partially restored, delineates a cycle so elaborate that it repeats every 18 years to reconcile solar and lunar calendars, a system likely older than written history itself. It was precision elevated to sacred duty. The Sumerians looked up and learned to rule by what they saw. The priests of Nippur looked up and learned to rule by what others believed they saw. The structure of power hidden in those patterns is breathtakingly modern. Authority could be measured, standardized, and codified into intervals. When festival seasons kept citizens busy with ceremony, there was less space for unrest. When taxes were due at divinely appointed times, dissatisfaction could be framed as impiety. Even the reigns of kings were tethered to the celestial ledger. A ruler's legitimacy depended on his harmony with the prescribed calendar. To rule out of season was heresy against heaven. Modern scholars, Reading the Nippur tablets under the controlled light of museums, see the outlines of the first-time bureaucracy. Here lies the birth of fiscal years and civic schedules, the prelude to an organized planet where every appointment, train schedule, and fiscal quarter still traces its ancestry to these clay rows. In a sense, humanity's first empire was not of land, but of minutes. The priests had discovered that mastery of time could replace armies. Conquer a people's schedule, and you conquer their perception of reality. Yet within these same walls, the line between awe and calculation remained thin. Many of the tablets oscillate between astronomy and worship, as if their authors never quite agreed whether they were measuring orbit or miracle. Lists of planetary gods spill alongside fractions. One column names Enlil, Sin, and Inanna, beside numerical values for their cycles. To record a god's motion was to confirm his existence. The stars insisted on obedience. The scribes translated that obedience into system. When the city later fell, the library collapsed under its own weight, sealing tablets together in ash. Thousands survived, fused into compact blocks like geological strata of thought. Today, when curators separate them, the impressions of long-dead fingers sometimes remain. It is haunting to imagine a priest closing his workroom for the night, trusting those cold numbers to hold the world in rhythm. The desire that once built Eridu and Uruk now took its seat on the invisible throne of time. From the calculations of Nippur onward, societies would be measured not by the favor of gods alone, but by their ability to keep the heavens and the harvest synchronized. A task as political as it was sacred, and one that continues in subtler form with every tick of our modern clocks. The transition from gods who ruled forever to kings who ruled for a time remade more than calendars. It remade the human soul. Once eternity had slipped from mortal hands, people began searching for another kind of permanence, one that could exist in conduct rather than in lifespan. Across the cities of Sumer and Akkad, the old certainty that kings were divine slowly eroded. They could still claim the gods' favor, but they could no longer claim to be the gods themselves. Mortality had introduced a new kind of conscience. A ruler's immortality now depended not on his blood, but on his justice. The change can be tracked through texts as clearly as an eclipse. On the earliest inscriptions, kings speak in voices that thunder with divine identity. I, servant of Anu, am Enlil upon the earth. Later carvings soften to humility. I am the shepherd whom Enlil has appointed. That single linguistic descent, from being to serving, marks the beginning of ethics. Power was no longer inherited from heaven by nature. It was lent, and it came with rules. To misrule was to break an oath to the gods who had allowed one to rule at all. Oaths soon became the spine of politics. Kings stood before priestly witnesses and swore to uphold fairness in measures, to safeguard widows and orphans, and to treat conquered peoples without cruelty. Failing these vows was not just ineptitude, it was sin. Tablets from the city of Lagash recount one ruler ordering the return of seized lands after oracles declared that injustice had angered the divine. The god Ningirsu, protector of truth, demanded restitution. The chronicle praises the king not for victory but for contrition. For the first time, moral correction, rather than divine ancestry, legitimized authority. Images carved on temple walls reflect this evolution in spirit. Instead of a monarch towering alone with rays around his head, scenes show him clasping hands with priests or kneeling before a seated deity to receive the staff and ring of office. It is less coronation than contract. The gods ceased to be co-rulers and became the witnesses of lawful government. The distance between heaven and palace extended, but that distance gave humanity room to build its conscience. a moral architecture as intricate as the ziggurats themselves. Writing again played midwife to the transformation. Laws could now be recorded and publicly displayed. A king who etched his decrees into stone ceded some of his mystery. He allowed his subjects to hold him accountable to his own words. The most famous of these centuries later would be Hammurabi's Code, a monument of both authority and vulnerability. Its prologue dedicates the laws to the gods, yet its function is earthly. Arbitration between people. In making ethics public, the kings became mortal in yet another sense. They exposed their rule to scrutiny. This moral awakening did not erase the divine, it humanized it. The gods remained vast and temperamental, but they began to prefer justice over spectacle. Their favor turned on fairness rather than sacrifice. In one hymn to Shamash, the sun god is praised not for his power, but for his clarity. He sees the crooked and makes it straight. Through his light, the judge is wise. Such lines echo the same psychological shift that Gilgamesh endured when he realized strength could not defy death, but compassion could outlast it. The fall of divine kingship thus became the rise of responsibility. The scepter once symbolized cosmic order. Now it symbolized judgment according to law. The heavens had withdrawn, leaving their reflection in humanity's conscience. The people of Mesopotamia, who once waited for kingship to descend from above, discovered that they had to hold it up themselves, sustained not by miracles, but by the weight of their own promises. Civilization's awakening was not an act of rebellion against heaven, but a quiet agreement with it. The understanding that what the gods had once enforced from above, humans must now uphold within. Today, the floodplains of southern Iraq stretch outward in a long shimmer of heat, their cracked soil and mirrored pools reflecting both sky and memory. The land looks silent, but under its surface lies a second landscape. Ghost neighborhoods, temple foundations, entire riverbeds long since buried by the slow rearrangement of sediment. When the rains fall briefly each winter, the clay releases a faint smell of salt and age, as if exhaling fragments of stories still trapped below. It was once believed that archaeology had already revealed the full extent of Sumer, that every layer of the first civilization had been charted. But in recent years, machines have started listening where shovels could not reach, and the plain is beginning to murmur again. The new ears are the satellites that glide above Mesopotamia, capturing shifts of color invisible to human sight. With infrared sensors and radar measured in millimeters, they can peer beneath sand and silt to trace the lines of forgotten canals or the brick outlines of settlements smothered by centuries of flood. Ground-penetrating radar scans, taken from drones and field vehicles, map variations in density, painting ghostly silhouettes of cities that never made it into history books. Each anomaly, every geometric echo, might hide another archive of clay tablets. A room collapsed and sealed at just the right moment, the air long gone, but the words intact. The technology has already rewritten parts of the map. During the dry season, one satellite image revealed a faint rectangular grid west of ancient Uruk. Excavation confirmed it was a suburb, dating from an era scholars thought post-Sumerian, extending the footprint of civilization by centuries. Another discovery near Eridu hints at possible ziggurat foundations older than the known Temple of Enki, their angles buried under meters of flood sediment. Each revelation tightens the connection between myth and topography. It seems entirely plausible now that further digging could uncover older layers still, the missing chapters in a story that began with kings who ruled for 241,000 years. If such tablets exist, they might clarify whether the ancient scribes were recording memory, mathematics, or metaphor. yet they might just as easily blur the lines further. Every find in Mesopotamia seems to complicate understanding rather than complete it. For instance, the more early scripts emerge, the clearer it becomes that writing did not spring fully formed from a single city, but evolved along several river routes simultaneously. The same could be true of the King List. What we know may only be a local version of a narrative, repeated across vanished settlements still sleeping under the mud. A single new tablet discovered tomorrow could reorder everything: the ages of the rulers, the origin of measurement, even the sequence of the flood itself. Archaeologists working the plain often describe a strange intimacy with absence. They spend hours staring at squiggles of data on radar output, translating them into the lives of people who once floated reeds through these same waters. To them, technology is not just a tool, but a kind of resurrection. When the strip of radar returns as a pattern of right angles, it conjures an entire street. When a darker shadow appears, perhaps the void of a collapsed chamber, they imagine shelves, rows of tablets, the palm prints of the last scribe who set them down before flood or conquest swallowed them. Such work is slow and delicate, but the implications are vast. The ground beneath Mesopotamia functions like the planet's subconscious, holding memories it refuses to share too easily. Each generation has extracted a different secret from it. First the myth, then the history. Now perhaps the awareness that the two are inseparable. If there are truly unseen layers still waiting, they may not yield certainty, but a deeper humility. Every grain of that soil has rearranged itself countless times since these civilizations fell, folding myth, data, and dream into one continuum. The flood may have washed the surface clean, but beneath it, the story still breathes, patient, whispering through static, waiting for the next question to disturb its sleep. Long after the last Sumerian city crumbled into dry river silt, another story of a drowned world began to drift across the Mediterranean. It came from Plato, written in the calm geometry of Greek philosophy. The tale of Atlantis, a powerful civilization swallowed by the sea in a single day and night of disaster. On the surface, it seems far from the flood of Ziusudra and Utnapishtim, separated by language, geography, and faith. Yet when scholars read them side by side, the resemblance hums unmistakably, as if the echo of one had traveled centuries beneath the waves to resurface in another tongue. Plato claimed to have heard the story through ancestral memory, a chain of transmission stretching from Egyptian priests to Solon to himself. The priests, he said, preserved records of a mighty island beyond the pillars of Heracles, whose arrogance angered the gods and led to its destruction. The moral read like the great Sumerian cycle of deluge and renewal. A society reaching too far, forgetting its balance with the divine, then erased and reborn in fragments. If the Sumerian flood symbolized the loss of divine intimacy, Atlantis represented a similar mourning, the fall from golden harmony into the fragile uncertainty of human civilization. There is no evidence of direct contact between Sumer and Plato's Greece, but cultural memory does not need courier ships. Myths flow as rivers do, joining and separating across ages, carrying their sediments of meaning. Flood stories and sunken cities appear everywhere. From India's Manu to the Aboriginal Dreamtime, to the Americas where sky serpents and ocean spirits restore drowned worlds. The consistency of those motifs suggests not conspiracy, but shared human experience. People have always lived by water. They have always seen floods swallow their labor. They have always woken after the storm to rebuild and to wonder what lesson the universe was trying to teach. Such memories solidify into myth because they explain the inexplicable, the tremor of the earth, the sudden silence where a village once stood, the humbling recognition that creation and destruction are twin tides. Viewed that way, the whisper of Atlantis becomes less a tale of a lost supercivilization and more a reaction to the same ancestral trauma that forged Sumer's stories. Plato's island may never have existed in the Atlantic, but it existed somewhere in human thought. The archetype of knowledge turned pride, and pride punished by nature's impartial hand. The Greeks, inheriting the Mesopotamian habit of reading morality from cataclysm, gave the lesson a new stage. The ocean instead of the Euphrates, gods renamed but equally unforgiving. Modern researchers find the recurrence almost mathematical. Every few millennia, the Earth delivers an event large enough to scar memory. Sudden sea level climbs, collapsing coastlines, volcanic winters. Survivors wrap those physical facts in symbols sturdy enough to cross generations. A local flood becomes a universal deluge. A drowned delta transforms into the idea of a lost continent. Atlantis, Dilmun, Lemuria. Each the mind's attempt to reconcile evidence of ancient catastrophe with the intuition that our story began, and will likely end, in water. The fascination persists because the myths whisper both fear and invitation. They suggest that our ancestors knew more than we credit them for, that they sensed the planet's enormity, its cycles of birth and submergence. Some scientists, tracing oral traditions among coastal peoples, have shown that such stories can preserve accurate details of sea level change for thousands of years. Myth becomes a vessel of data, a poetic archive that stores geological memory long after instruments have crumbled. Sumer's flood narrative and Plato's sunken empire may thus be two different languages describing the same ancient memory. The Earth's own pulse and the fragility of human mastery. Each retelling adds another layer, another contour to the same caution. The ruins of Sumer and the imagined spires of Atlantis meet in silence beneath the metaphorical sea, united by what they try to teach. That civilizations, however advanced, remain guests at the mercy of creation's tides. Their stories endure because those tides still rise, as patient as ever, reminding us that nothing built by hands is truly unsinkable, and that somewhere deep within our species, the memory of drowning still hums softly, waiting to be retold. Among the ruins of Nippur and later Babylon, fragments of tablets carry a curious refrain, warnings carved in deliberate, almost anxious hands. These are the words of before the flood. One begins, followed by the phrase, "to be kept from the uninitiated." Another, broken along its edge, cautions that the wisdom of kings who ruled when the heavens were near is not for all eyes. Those somber sentences, scattered among prayers and mathematical tables, have puzzled scholars for decades. Why, in a culture so devoted to preserving knowledge, would the priests suddenly demand secrecy? The answer, many believe, lies in fear, not just of ignorance, but of discovery. By the time these texts were copied, the memory of the great flood and of the divine rulers before it had transformed into something sacred and dangerous. The priests who guarded Sumer's libraries understood knowledge as a double-edged instrument. Properly handled, it could maintain harmony between gods and mortals. In the wrong hands, it could provoke catastrophe. To reveal too much of the world's hidden structure was to challenge the cosmic hierarchy, risking another fall from grace. The flood, in this reading, was not only a punishment for arrogance, but a purification of misplaced intelligence. The survivors were warned never again to attempt divine comprehension without moral restraint. During the centuries when Mesopotamian temples doubled as universities, scribal apprentices were trained under vows of loyalty resembling oaths of silence. Certain tablets, Lists of star omens, arcane medicine recipes, or the formulas connecting planetary positions to fate could only be read by senior priests. A young scribe might copy them, but not interpret them. The idea was that knowledge untempered by wisdom invited hubris, the very flaw that, in their cosmology, had drowned the world once already. To guard hidden wisdom became a form of piety. The fear of forbidden learning reverberates through later traditions. The Hebrews called it the sin of the Watchers, angels who descended to teach humanity charms and metallurgy, corrupting innocence. The Greeks turned it into the myth of Prometheus, stealing fire from the gods. The theme is constant. Enlightenment bringing both creation and ruin. The flame that warms, also capable of burning. The Mesopotamian priests recognized this paradox first. Their tablets describe the lost arts of the antediluvian sages, the Apkallu, who taught humankind writing, irrigation, and crafts, then were banished to the sea after misusing their own gifts. Their return was always feared, for they represented the temptation to reclaim the fullness of godlike power. In the guarded libraries, censorship did not mean ignorance. It meant containment. Secret knowledge could be spoken only during rituals, wrapped in allegory and chant, so that its raw language would remain veiled, behind symbol. When the priests studied astronomy, they did so intertwined with theology, ensuring no observation could stray from divine narrative. If a planet's motion suggested new patterns in the heavens, they explained it as an omen, not a discovery. Control of knowledge preserved both order and hierarchy. The gods above, the priests as interpreters, the people below, trusting that some mysteries were safer unexamined. To modern eyes, this may look like superstition, yet there is something heartbreakingly pragmatic about it. The ancients lived in a world where floods, eclipses, and plagues reminded them daily how fragile civilization could be. To possess deep understanding without moral containment was to risk courting the same chaos that had erased the cities before. Their fear was not of science, but of imbalance. Of repeating an error humanity was still too young to survive again. Through their secrecy, the priests unintentionally ensured immortality for their warnings. Each generation that stumbled across a sealed tablet or an unreadable symbol felt the same thrill of potential transgression. The mystery persists precisely because they tried to suppress it. The forbidden knowledge of the pre-flood age became more powerful as rumor than as fact. An eternal cautionary tale whispering from clay. In every civilization since, the echo lingers. Certain truths must be earned, not inherited, or the world will once again remember how easily it can drown itself in its own brilliance. Across the laboratories and observatories of our own time, a new kind of scribe has taken up the ancient work of interpreting the world. Instead of clay tablets, they use genomes, satellite readings, and sediment cores. Yet, what they are assembling looks startlingly familiar. A chronicle of cataclysm and renewal that mirrors the old flood stories almost detail for detail. The language has changed, but the substance is the same. There was a time when humankind nearly vanished, when seas rose, storms reshaped continents, and survival hinged on small pockets of endurance. Myth, it seems, had been telling the truth all along, only in a different dialect. Geneticists were the first to sense the pattern. Mapping mitochondrial DNA across global populations, they found traces of a dramatic bottleneck, roughly 75,000 to 100,000 years ago. A massive volcanic eruption in Indonesia, known as Toba, had dimmed the sky and cooled the earth for decades. Humanity dwindled to scarcely a few thousand breeding individuals, a fragility barely wider than the foundation of a single city. The discoveries did not describe a deluge of water, but a flood of ash and darkness. Yet the effect, mass death, migration, renewal, felt eerily consistent with the myths of cleansing and rebirth. Those who survived must have carried the memory of narrow escape deep in their collective psyche, transmitting it not as data, but as sacred narrative. Climatologists added new layers to the story. Ice core samples from Greenland captured abrupt warming at the end of the last ice age, the same period when melted glaciers sent oceans surging over coastal plains. The land that once joined Britain to mainland Europe drowned beneath what is now the North Sea. Similar floods erased the shorelines of Southeast Asia and the Persian Gulf. Computer models reveal that the Gulf Basin, dry and inhabited for millennia, filled rapidly around 8000 BCE, the same region and timing long associated with the birth of Sumer. The Mesopotamian tales of a civilization wiped clean by rising waters may have been echoing this real and terrifying event, remembered by ancestors whose villages sank beneath the new sea. Linguists also hear the resonance. They trace cognates of the word for flood, sea, or deluge across distant language families, embedded in myths that share identical motifs. Divine warning, construction of boats, salvation of seeds or animals, and covenant after survival. These parallels are too specific to be coincidence. They hint at a story carried by migrating peoples from the Near East into Europe, Africa, and Asia, shifting its details but never its emotional core. Memory travels not only through stones and genes, but through the grammar of storytelling. What emerges from this convergence of science and legend is not the disproof of myth, but its vindication. The ancients were not naive inventors spinning fairy tales. They were eyewitnesses to environmental devastation with no modern vocabulary to express it. What we call myth was their attempt at field notes, a fusion of grief, reverence, and warning set to rhythm so it could be remembered. The kings who ruled for absurd spans, the floods that erased their empires, the gods who wept or raged. All can now be viewed as metaphors for the immense forces of climate and time, whose signatures are still visible in ice and sediment. In this light, the grandeur of those stories grows rather than shrinks. The flood myth becomes one of the oldest psychological fossils, a cultural gene surviving countless mutations. Science, by dissecting it, restores its magnificence in new terms. Data confirms what faith had felt, that humanity has endured apocalypses and returned changed, carrying fossils of memory within our cells and languages. Each measurement, each data set, gives new precision to the ancient idea that we are children of both disaster and persistence. The Sumerians wrote that the world began anew after the waters receded. Genetics and geology today quietly agree. The cycle of ruin and renewal they sang about is not simply cosmic poetry. It is evolution's own refrain, still playing underneath the hum of our cities, reminding us that creation and survival have always been the same story told in successive tongues. When the archaeologists finish their work and the dust settles back over the open trenches, what remains of the Sumerian King List is not merely a record of names but an allegory hewn from clay itself. It is humanity's first warning written in durable material, that every ascent carries its own gravity, that pride has tides as real as the rivers that once obeyed these kings. Across its cracks and gaps, the tablets seem to murmur the same message. Power without humility invites the flood. Time and again, history has returned to test how well we have learned it. The early scribes were blunt about the rhythm. Kingship, they wrote, descended from heaven. Later they added, when dynasties ended, the flood swept over. Between those two sentences lies the perpetual human heartbeat, achievement and erasure. Each city that rose along the Euphrates imagined itself ordained by the gods. Each extended its reach until the soil refused to support it or the rivers changed course. The pattern was neither punishment nor accident. It was balance reasserting itself. Resources stretched, authority hardened, and new floods of water, of invasion, of debt washed the arrogance away. Within that cyclical understanding, the King List is less a chronology than a mirror. It tells societies, even now, that there is no peak unassailable, no civilization immune to its own excess. The long spans of the mythical rulers were a way of confessing that even greatness must end. The reduction of those reigns from tens of millennia to mere decades symbolized the humanization of authority, but also the constant fall from grace. Each newly crowned monarch was both descendant and cautionary tale. Archaeologists unearthing those tablets sometimes remark on their weight. Clay in hand feels heavier than paper, the wedge marks sharp like deliberate scars. That physical gravity suits the moral gravity inscribed on them. The act of recording was itself an act of repentance. The realization that immortality in flesh was impossible, so memory must serve in its place. To write, "Then the flood swept over," was to acknowledge responsibility. To accept that destruction comes not from the whim of gods alone, but from human blindness to equilibrium. In this sense, the King List belongs not to Mesopotamia alone, but to every civilization that has mistaken growth for destiny. Empires have risen in the same rhythm. The Nile kingdoms, Rome, the dynasties of China, the industrial powers of our own era, all convinced their order would outlast the storms forming beyond at their horizon. The flood need not always be water. It can be famine, corruption, environmental ruin, or the silent erosion of meaning. The clay tablets become reminders that progress without humility eventually collapses under its own brilliance. Yet the tone of the ancient text is not purely fatalistic. After each devastation, the scribes always wrote a new beginning. When the flood had swept over, kingship descended again. The cycle continues, but every recurrence carries a faint refinement. The rebuilt city rises on the ruins of the prior one, just as stories rise from memory. Even the deluge is part of the process, renewal disguised as ruin. The Sumerians, with their unflinching realism, saw that creation and collapse were companions, not enemies. The flood was not an eraser, but a teacher. Standing before those tablets now, in museums far from the river plains that birthed them, one can almost feel the heartbeat of their lesson. Each wedge pressed into clay is both warning and hope. It tells us that the measure of a civilization is not in how high it builds, but in how gracefully it can begin again. Pride builds towers, humility writes tablets. The first are inevitably toppled, but the second continue speaking long after rivers have changed their courses. What survives of Sumer is neither its walls nor its kings, but the understanding they left behind, buried in clay, waiting for future ages to rediscover. That wisdom is the only monument the flood cannot drown. In the still air of a museum gallery, surrounded by polished marble and the murmurs of distant visitors, one tablet rests behind glass. Its surface is small enough to fit in a pair of hands, yet its etchings carry the echo of ages. The wedge-shaped symbols are worn soft at the edges, the color of weathered bone. They look unassuming until the light catches them, and suddenly the grooves seem to flicker with the same fire that danced over ancient oil lamps. Here rests the Sumerian King List, or rather, one of its surviving fragments, an artifact that holds the story humanity has been telling itself since it first realized time would not wait. Looking at it, the impossible numbers no longer read as absurd. They feel like poetry written in mathematics, an attempt to translate infinity into the earthly language of years. Each exaggerated reign whispers of the same longing: to refuse erasure. The kings who reputedly ruled for 28,000 or 36,000 years are not evidence of delusion, but of an undying hope that something of us might endure beyond the natural span of flesh. The clay's cool permanence offered a promise that the body could not: an early technology of memory. Standing before such a relic, it is hard not to sense an unbroken thread stretching through us. The Sumerian scribe pressing his stylus into soft clay, the medieval monk copying fading manuscripts by candlelight, the modern scientist typing data into databases. All partake in that same impulse, a collective defiance of oblivion. The materials change, but the gesture is identical. To record is to resist the flood. To remember is to build a wall of words against time. The tablet seems to hum with that defiance. Those impossible lifespans, instead of mistakes, become metaphors for continuity. A ruler remembered long enough becomes, in a sense, immortal. His reign stretches as far as the generations that speak his name. In this way, the King List was not wrong at all. The first kings did rule for uncountable years, not in flesh, but in memory. Every archaeologist who brushes away dust from a buried city extends their dominion a little further. Every historian who translates another fragment grants them another breath. Immortality is merely the moment when remembrance outweighs decay. Museums are our modern ziggurats. We build them to reassure ourselves that order can triumph over entropy, that we too can arrest the current for a heartbeat. In the dim glow of the exhibit, the wedge marks of the King List seem to merge with the reflections of visitors staring through glass. For a moment, the past looks back at the present, and the distinction between observer and subject blurs. The ancient scribe once wondered whether his words would survive. Our presence here is his answer. Yet the tablet also warns, as its myths always intended, that endurance without humility turns brittle. The same desire for permanence that inspires us to preserve can, in excess, make us careless of the living world that sustains future memory. The flood is always circling back, reinvented as climate, war, or neglect. Perhaps the lesson is not to chase eternity blindly, but to craft it responsibly, to write on the clay of our time with an awareness that others will read our marks. As the museum lights dim at closing hour, the script catches a last glint of gold. The wedge impressions glow like constellations, the same ones the Sumerians studied long before any calendar bore their name. The line between earth and sky, between myth and science, collapses into quiet reverence. These signs, crudely beautiful, enduring beyond empires, remind us that what humanity seeks is not immortality of the body, but continuity of meaning. The kings of 241,000 years still reign, not as rulers of stone, but as voices in the collective imagination. Proof that knowledge, once set down in any form, outlives its makers. And in that simple miracle, the persistence of understanding, we find eternity enough.